Welcome to the Crimson Engine. My name is 𝙍𝙐𝙄𝙄𝙗 and today we are looking at the cinematography and production design of Cyberpunk 2077. This is an absolutely beautiful game for whatever other faults it has, and it has quite a few. Night City and surroundings are a captivating, compelling place to spend your time, and there is a lot to look at, a lot to explore. So how did CD Projekt Red create this environment and come up with a very, very unique aesthetic for this world that Cyberpunk 2077 occurs within? They did so by using a variety of visual techniques and tricks that we're going to look at, most of which you can also use in your filmmaking to create a equally compelling aesthetic, though unless you have somewhere like $800 million, you may be pushed to come up with the same result. The first thing you'll notice in Cyberpunk, in the way that it differs from a movie, probably even its own cinematics, is deep focus. This is when the very, very far background and the very, very near foreground are both sharp. So that means you can see a lot further into your environment. If the camera was, f2.8 or something like that, you would only really see your hands and the person in front of you, and everything else would be lost in a blur. That kind of bokeh isn't really possible in a game, so CD Projekt Red had no option but to create a very deep focal plane and fill it with all kinds of interesting things. They also found different ways to separate the subject, which we'll talk about a little bit in lighting and in color. But generally, how this is different from a film is that it is very deep focus. The next thing I want to touch on is texture. This game has so much texture, it's unbelievable. You can imagine a production designer, art director, art team trying to create props for this in real life would literally go insane because there is so much stuff. I'm sure they generated a lot of this dynamically, but they did so with an algorithm that produces a really incredible result. And I think the reason that the cyberpunk genre in general and Cyberpunk 2077 specifically succeeds in this is that there's multiple layers on every object. What I mean by that is that there's an intended design aesthetic for an object, say a car, where you can see the manufacturer's and the designer's mindset when they built it. Then other people have got it and modded it and played with it and put things on top of it. It's like aftermarket accessories, and then on top of that secondary design aesthetic, you have all kinds of wear and tear and repairs. This is the key to making the objects of the cyberpunk world seem believable, not seem as sterile and futuristic, and it's informed by these multiple uses: the original, the aftermarket, and the kind of dark hands of life, the wabi-sabi, getting hold of these objects and using them in ways different than they were intended. You see this also in the technology. You see computers that were built for one purpose and have been repurposed and then rehacked for something else, and so they have wires coming out the side of them. The train station is a really good example of this, where God knows how much stuff has been put in there that it was different from its intended purposes. The next thing we'll talk about is color combinations. Now, everyone's very familiar with the classic orange and teal look, the orange skin tones and the teal backgrounds. The warm draws forward and creates foreground. The cool pulls back and creates background. You get that beautiful separation. These are complementary colors on the color wheel, meaning they're opposite of one another. There are other complementary color combinations that aren't used nearly as much because they, don't really blend that well with skin tone. Green and red are some of these, the Christmas colors. Purple and yellow are another classic color combination, as well as the one that gets used a lot in this game, which is magenta and green. These colors really pop off one another and create a really pleasing, if unfamiliar, color contrast, and it seems to tie the aesthetic together really well and make it seem otherworldly. As far as lighting the environments with these color combinations and these textures, Cyberpunk uses a pretty interesting lighting scheme. It's usually a large overhead soft source that's flagged off the wall, so it appears only on the character, but it doesn't have deep shadows, but it's very toppy, so it gives shadows under the eye. Sometimes they'll switch this up and have a single uplight source, but it's usually pretty neutral in color so that it doesn't make the people look too alien and too sick. Then in this sort of room tone exposure, they'll add their other signature lights, like their signature colors, and all of them are usually tied to the environment, so they're practical working lights. A lot of them will be pinpoint sources like I have going on here, and that creates a lot of dynamic range in the frames. So you have something that's pure white right next to something that's pure black. That contrast also makes the frames really captivating to the eye. To do this in film, you probably need two lights. You need the light that is going to color the background, and then you need the environmental light that's actually going to be the apparent source. So here I have some Pavo tubes, I think they're 5Cs, but I also have a 1x1 on the ground that's actually illuminating, because you can see without the actual 1x1, the actual tube light doesn't give off that much light. Certainly if it's pointed towards camera, it's not going to affect the area around it. Our brain thinks that the source is the one giving off the light, but that's not really possible. So if you want to create this sort of effect inside your own films, you'll need two lights. Probably the reason I had such a positive experience of Cyberpunk 2077 is I was able to play it all on the Dell Precision 5750 workstation. It is an Intel Core i7 with an NVIDIA RTX 3000 graphics card. It has a 512 SSD and a 17-inch screen, but it's still under £5. It's a really beautiful workstation, and it really fits the aesthetic of Cyberpunk 2077. So thanks to Dell for sponsoring this video. Cyberpunk 2077 uses a lot of flares straight into the camera with very interesting effects. Of course, they're not real flares, there's no real glass, it's just being rendered in real time. But it's probably the best example I've seen of this being used, and the reason that they use it is that the character you're playing, V, does have optical implants. He does have, or she does have, glass or some kind of perspex in their eyes, which is what is bouncing the light off and causing the multiple reflections and flares. I don't know if you change your optical implants, you get different shapes of flares. I wouldn't be sure about that, but it is pretty cool. And I think it's one way they make up for the deep depth of field. Another technique that Cyberpunk 2077 uses really well is multiple environmental sources. Within a given environment, you may have 150 different small little lights. Some of them are illuminating you, some of them are illuminating pockets of the environment. A lot of them are shooting into the camera and creating all these little pieces of and pockets of light. They add to this by what's called specularity, meaning that usually the floor is shiny or it's wet. People's jackets are like patent leather, or there's metallic surfaces that reflect the light. So instead of having 100 sources, if the floor is wet, you have 200 sources because those 100 sources are reflecting in the ground below them. The classic version of this is looking out at the city and seeing all the night lights and the neon and the flares. It really adds to a dense real-world environment. If you compare this with your classic studio shot movie, every one of those lights has to be installed, has to be maintained, and has to be adjusted. So there's sort of an upper limit. You can only have so much manpower, whereas again, like Cyberpunk can dynamically generate millions of these things, and you have this really dense, specular, reflective environments that are really captivating. If you're looking for a way to generate this sort of look for your science fiction films, a good place to start is look at what is in your environment. Look at how the natural light illuminates the places that we live and work in, and then try and deviate from that as much as possible. The effect that Cyberpunk has that is really compelling, that feels so foreign and alien, is because they pretty much try every trick in the book to modify every element of the scene from its original purpose or from what it looks like in real life. So instead of downlight, they'll have uplight. Instead of tungsten daylight, they'll have bright green, bright blue, or bright red. Surfaces that are normally matte will be shiny. Surfaces that are normally shiny will be super shiny. It really is this assault on the senses of the unfamiliar that makes us want to explore the world more and more, to try and make sense of it, try and discover it, try and become familiar with it. That is one of our instincts as human beings. And when you have an environment that is so different, it sort of both confuses and stimulates us. I think Cyberpunk as a game has done that really, really well. That is my look at the cinematography of Cyberpunk 2077. The link to the laptop is down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.